Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had a wonderfully relaxing week. Not too much to do during the week between Christmas and New Year's. Just hanging around the house, spent a little time with friends and family. Got a lot of crocheting done. I know, I'm old, but I do love to crochet, and I feel like I need to be doing something. I guess there's lots of decluttering or cleaning I could do, but I get much more joy from crocheting than I do cleaning. I have a confession to make. I've never watched Grey's Anatomy, and so during this past week, I've been crocheting and watching Grey's Anatomy. I'm all the way on season 3, almost done season 3, and I have fallen in love with it, and I can't stop. On to New Year's now. I've never been a big New Year's Eve girl. I don't like going out to parties. I don't do well in crowded bars, so I usually stay home. I always check in once an hour or so on Times Square to see how the festivities are going, and then about 30 seconds to midnight, I watch the ball drop. When I was younger, each New Year's Eve at midnight, my dad would open the front door to the house and scream at the top of his lungs, "Fuck you, so-and-so, and fuck you, so-and-so." He'd always add the names of people who had pissed him off throughout the year. He would go through the entire list of people he hated or had issues with, and, of course, all to the absolute mortification of my mom. It was a real adventure growing up with Bob McNall, let me tell you. So in keeping with my dad's tradition each year, I opened the front door, but instead of screaming, I just let the old year out and welcome the new year in. Say hello and I love yous to the loved ones I've lost, and close the door. Nowadays, my neighbors would more than likely call the cops if I were to break into a scream fest of obscenities. Well, I hope you made it through Christmas or holidays happily and healthily. I want to wish you nothing but the best for our year to come. Let's make 2025 one of the best years of our lives. Happy New Year. Other than that, not too much else to report from my little corner of Ontario, so let's get the business out of the way, shall we? If you enjoy this episode or any episode, please head over to our Patreon page and support the show. The link will be in the show notes. For less than a cardboard New Year's hat, you can help keep the show going. You can also support the show on Spotify. And please remember to like, follow, and share the show with all of your friends. Oh, and give the show a 5-star review on Apple. That's enough of the business. Let's get to this week's case. You know, I love a good cult story, and I realized that I hadn't done any episodes on a cult as of yet. So because I am Canadian, I thought we could start with an absolutely horrifically horrible Canadian cult. I'm going to put a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode because there is so many horrific things that happen in this case. It's just awful. There is everything you can imagine and more. And so I'm giving a trigger warning that this is going to be a graphic, horrible case. So if you're not in the mood for that, this might be an episode to skip. The dogs are sleeping behind me, so Puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper today. So grab a cup of tea. Better put a shot in it, because this is a horrible one. And maybe keep the bottle next to you, because it's also a long one. Sit back and relax while I tell you about the case of Roch Theriault and the Anthill Kids cult. As always, I want to give the victims in the case top billing, and sadly, as in most of our cases, there are numerous victims. So to anyone affected by this case, I acknowledge you and send my love to you, wherever you may be. The power a cult leader wields often stems from a carefully cultivated persona, blending charisma, apparent wisdom, and an unwavering certainty. They exploit vulnerabilities, offering a sense of belonging and purpose to those who feel lost or marginalized. Through techniques like love bombing, isolation, and thought stopping, they erode critical thinking and replace it with unquestioning obedience. The leader's pronouncements become absolute truth, and any dissent is framed as a betrayal of the group, creating a climate of fear and conformity. This process can dismantle the moral compass of an individual, leading them to passively observe or even participate in harmful acts they would previously have condemned. The transformation of a typically moral individual into a passive bystander within a cult is a chilling testament to the power of group dynamics and psychological manipulation. The pressure to conform, coupled with the fear of expulsion and the erosion of individual identity, can lead to a kind of moral disengagement. Believing that the leader is infallible and that their actions are divinely ordained, members can rationalize even the most egregious acts, convincing themselves that they are serving a higher purpose. This can lead to the acceptance of horrific punishments and demeaning practices, often presented as necessary steps on a path to enlightenment or salvation. The question of when to intervene and challenge the actions of a cult is a complex one. The fear of judgment from within the group, along with the potential for shunning and social isolation, keeps many from speaking out. The insidious nature of thought control makes it difficult for members to recognize the abuse, often leading to a complete dependence on the group for validation and identity. It is crucial to understand that individuals within a cult are not simply making bad choices, but rather are victims of systematic manipulation and control. A safe haven for those trapped within a cult must be a place free from judgment, offering understanding, support, and a path towards reclaiming their autonomy and critical thinking skills. It requires a society willing to look beyond simple labels and recognize the complexities of cult dynamics, advocating for resources and interventions that prioritize the well-being of those held captive by fear and blind faith. On May 16, 1947, Roch Theriault was born in the Saguenay Valley of Quebec. So that would make him a shit bull on the shit zodiac wheel. Roch was the second of 7 children for Hyacinthe and Pierrette Thériault. Hyacinthe was his father and Pierrette was his mother. When I first read his parents' names, I thought Hyacinthe was his mother, but no, it's his father. I actually love that name, Hyacinthe, but I personally would give it to a girl. Moving on. In 1953, when Roch was 6, Hyacinthe and Pierrette moved the family to the community of Thedford Mines in the eastern townships of Quebec. Thedford Mines sits about an hour from the border with Maine. The town is known as the asbestos capital of Canada because, in 1876, large deposits of asbestos were found nearby. Thedford Mines became one of the leading producers of asbestos in the world during the majority of the 20th century. However, as we all know now, asbestos is actually a really bad thing, and Canada banned the use of it in July of 1989. After that, the mines started exporting asbestos to countries in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and South and Central America. But finally, in 2012, the final mine closed down. That's actually pretty terrifying that they were still producing asbestos as late as 2012. For those of you who don't know, asbestos is a mineral that naturally occurs in nature. It's made up of tiny fibers that are both fire and chemical resistant. When asbestos was first discovered, they started putting it in everything: insulation, floor and ceiling tiles, roofing shingles, pipes, appliances, cosmetics, talc products like baby powder, as well as brake pads. Dude, this stuff was everywhere. It was used in almost every single school in Canada because they thought that by using fire-resistant materials, they would be safeguarding the children. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? But then they found out that asbestos was bad, like really bad, like carcinogen bad. It caused cancers in the linings of the lungs and lung cancer and a whole host of breathing issues. Oh, and of course, death. So as a child who was born in the early 70s and grew up in the 80s, thanks for that. You can't tell if something has been built with asbestos in it just by looking at it. Now there are really expensive and extensive testings that have to be performed if the word asbestos is ever mentioned. So if you're looking for a house to buy and someone says the word asbestos, run the other fucking way fast. Asbestos never dies, but it is only dangerous when it is broken or moved. When someone disturbs the asbestos, the tiny little fibers that it's made of will float in the air for days, and that is what you breathe in, and that is what causes all the cancers and death. So if you just leave it alone, you're fine. But even a small breeze can make those fibers fly into the air. It is bad shit, man. It'll kill ya. Anyway, back to Roch. He and his brothers attended school, and they made it all the way to grade 7 before quitting. Later, Roch would state that his father Hyacinth would beat him as a child, but Hyacinth denied this claim to his dying day, and as far as I could find, none of Roch's siblings ever accused their father of beating them. So, without any actual physical proof, we won't ever know the truth about that. Hyacinth was a laborer and a member of the Union des Electeurs, or Union of Electors. This group was also known as the Beret Blanc, or White Berets. This group believed in H. Douglas's social credit movement in Canada, which basically believed that money or social credit should be distributed to the people of Canada so that the people would have enough income to purchase the goods and services that were being produced within Canada. This belief system actually produced political candidates, and in Alberta and British Columbia, their candidates won and had ruling parties for a time. I need to look into this because it sounds good to me. The members of these different groups would go door to door, handing out pamphlets promoting their belief system. Hyacinth would take Roch with him while out campaigning for his candidates. The Thériault family were also devout Catholics, and all the children were taken to church several times per week. And here's where it begins for Roch. Because he was a bright child, he started to question things within the Catholic belief system, and eventually he would come to resent Catholicism. Roch had a good childhood. He really had nothing to complain about. He was in a loving family, he had good role models in both his parents, but Roch early on realized that by telling others that everything was good with his life, he didn't receive a lot of attention. So he began to complain and lie about his home life to anyone who would listen, and he very quickly realized that he could attain way more attention from others through sympathy. And this began Roch's desire or lifelong craving for attention. But as we will soon see, this desire or craving was very rarely satiated. On November 11th, 1967, Roch married Francine Grenier, a girl he had met from the next town over, and the young couple moved to Montreal. By 1970, Francine had given birth to 2 sons, Roch Sylvain, known as Roch Jr., and Francois. Shortly after his children arrived, Roch developed serious ulcers and had to undergo surgery to repair them. But unfortunately, the surgery caused some unforeseen issues with Roch's digestive system, leaving him in constant pain and constant bitchiness. It was at this time that he became obsessed with medicine and anatomy. And when I say obsessed, I mean obsessed. obsessed. Roch wanted to know everything there was to know about the human body and the skeletal system and the nervous system, everything. Shortly after the issues with his digestive system arrived, he decided to move the family back to Thetford Mines, and it was at this time that he started developing an interest in woodworking, which will come into play much later and in a much horrible way. He also dabbled in local politics and joined Le Club Aramis, which is basically a French version of the Shriners. As well, Roch started to show a vested interest in sex and sexuality, which Francine really didn't appreciate, specifically all the experimentation that Roch was trying to do. Here's the thing. If you want to swing from the chandeliers while having sex, that's fine. More power to you. But find a partner that is willing to do it with you. And I can guarantee that the mother of your 2 young sons is too fucking tired to be participating in that shit. My God, I can remember how bloody exhausted I was when I had just 2 young boys. I wasn't interested in anything except sleep at that point. It was like, just put the nightie down when you're done and be fucking quiet. I'm sleeping. If you know, you know. Now, with all of these new interests for Roch, there was also one more. He took up drinking, but heavily. It started to affect his life, and since Francine wasn't interested in all his new sexual fantasies or his drinking, Roch started using his woodwork to come up with reasons for him to get out of Thetford Mines. He would tell Francine he had a trade show or something like that in Quebec City and take off for the weekend. And this is where he met Giselle. But in order for Roch to carry on his sexual exploration with Giselle on the weekends, it took most of his money, and eventually the bank foreclosed on the family's home. And that was pretty much the last straw for Francine, and she was out with the boys. Roch, who was pretty much in a continual drunken haze at this point in his life, merely moved to Quebec City and hooked up with Giselle. He built a bed in the back of his truck, and that was where he and Giselle carried out their sexual exploits. But Roch wanted to keep up the appearance to others that he was still a happily married man. So, the only time that Giselle and Roch were together was in the back of his truck. I have no idea why he would want to do this. Since Francine had already kicked his lying, cheating, drunk ass to the curb, he would have been free to take up with Giselle, but in Roch's mind, he was a happily married man, and the idea of someone from the outside knowing that he was cheating was not okay. It was during this time, when he was living in the back of his truck, that he found the Seventh-day Adventist Church. For those of you who don't know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a mainstream religion like other religions out there. They believe that the Bible is the rule book. They, like other religions, believe in a Sabbath day or day of rest where no work should be done. They also believe in the Holy Trinity, the Son, the Father, and the Holy Ghost, or Holy Spirit. They baptize their members. They believe that Jesus Christ's death redeemed humanity. See? Pretty much like all the other religions. But they do have a few different beliefs. They believe that the day of rest, or the Sabbath, is Saturday, not Sunday, like many other Christian religions. They follow the Seventh-day Adventist diet, which is a plant-based diet based on the book of Leviticus. It's a diet that is rich in whole foods and excludes most animal products, alcohol, and caffeinated beverages. So a lot of fruits, veggies, nuts, legumes, things like that. And they follow this diet because they believe that God created plants and fruit to be the human food, and that humans should live in harmony with nature, and that the diet will keep them healthier. And the healthier they are, the more they can serve God. They also believe that a judgment of all Christians began in 1844, and that it is this judgment that will distinguish true believers from fakers when the second coming of Christ happens. They also closely follow the writings of Ellen White, as a companion to the Bible. Ellen White was a prolific author. She wrote more than 40 books and over 5,000 periodical articles. Ellen was one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it is estimated that she had over 2,000 visions and dreams directly from the big guy upstairs. So many of those who follow this religion hold Ellen White in very high esteem. So let's just pause and take a little look at what we know about Roch so far. He craves attention, he has an addictive personality, drinking, sexual exploits, things like that, and he feels he has to keep up an appearance of perfection for those on the outside of the world. And he has just been introduced to a brand new doctrine, which he will become obsessed with. But just like all other religions, there are some who interpret the doctrine differently, and those are the ones who usually become extremists. The branch of the Adventists that Roch joined was ministered by a man named Pierre Zita. The group met every Saturday in a motel room, and just like everything else in Roch's life, he dove in head first and became completely absorbed with the religion. He quit drinking and began following a strict diet, as his newfound obsession suggested. Roch became obsessed with the Old Testament, stuff like fire and brimstone shit, where the man is the dominant in all relationships and women are basically servants. He also discovered the scriptures on the apocalypse and dove headfirst into those. He was intrigued by the fact that there would be a violent retribution at the end times and that all of mankind would be split into two groups, that of the elected and the reprobate. You all know this is not going to end well. During the meetings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Roch started being a boastful dick about his knowledge of the scriptures, and the rest of the members of the congregation slowly began to dislike Roch. Even they thought he was being a dick. But while all this was going on, Roch still had to eat. So to make money, he began selling Adventist literature door to door, and he was quite good at it. In fact, so good that Pierre Zita, the leader of the group, gave Roch the responsibility of running a smoking cessation workshop. Apparently, running this type of workshop is the beginning of training to eventually become a leader or an elder within the religion. Roch excelled at the workshop, and by 1977, Roch found himself with a few followers that had devoted themselves to him. They were Solange Boyard, 21, Chantal Labrie, 19, Francine Laflamme, 18, Nicole Ruel, 20, an 18-year-old girl known only as Maurice, José Pelletier, 20, Jacques Fissette, somewhere in his 20s, Claude Hulette, 24, and Jacques Guiguier, 24, with his wife, Maurice Grenier, 23, and their 6-month-old baby girl, Miriam. I hope I said most of those names close to correct, and if I didn't, I apologize. There's a lot of French in here, and I'm not French, so I'm going to do my best. Roch had managed to convince these few that he was going to become a priest in the Adventist religion, and they all agreed that they would follow him to create a new congregation. Red flag, that's a red flag right there. For the most part, this group hung around Giselle's apartment day in and day out. Roch managed to convince those that were attending college to drop out. He told them that the world was ending soon, so there really wasn't much sense in learning things for a world that was to be no more. This new group of Adventists that are now being led by Roch are literally hanging out in Giselle's apartment. And Giselle started to get a little jealous because all these pretty young chickies were doting on Roch and trying to, well, you can imagine what they were offering up to Roch, their new spiritual leader. Now, it was about this time that Pierre Zita and some of the other elders from the original congregation that Roch attended started to become concerned that those that had followed Roch were more interested in jumping into bed with Roch than they actually were with the doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In 1977, Roch and his followers attended an Adventist retreat on Lake Roos up near Muskoka, Ontario, which is an absolutely breathtaking area of Ontario. It's close to the shores of Georgian Bay, and several provincial parks are up there. The landscape is amazing. If you ever have a chance to go to that area, go. During the retreat, Roch claimed that while he was out for a hike one day, he sat down on an outcropping and had a vision where the sky was white with radiance and the voice of God spoke to him, telling him that the spot where he was sitting was a holy place. And I'm sure the announcement of Roch's vision and message from God helped to recruit both Gabrielle Laver, who was attending the retreat from a church in Quebec, and Yolande Guinibert, who was from France. Both girls joined Roch's little troop of misfits and left with the group when the retreat was over. Roch had his little band of followers, and he was doing quite well for himself with the door-to-door sales of the Adventist literature. He was also gaining a reputation as a healer. So he decided it was time to move his followers and branch out on his own. He moved the group to Sainte-Marie, Quebec, a city that is about 65 kilometers south of Quebec City. Here, the group opened the Healthy Living Clinic. It had a storefront that specialized in alternative medicine and holistic literature that, according to Roch, could cure any issue anyone was having. As well, there was an inpatient unit where Roch and the group members would conduct natural healings, quote unquote, for more serious afflictions. Of course, the clinic had a few solid policies: cash up front, no returns, and no refunds. Can you say snake oil salesman? Roch also decided on uniforms for the group: ankle-length pullover tunics. The women's were green and the men wore beige. Roch wore a dark brown tunic. I bet those tunics just showed off all the curves. The clinic was doing well. So well, in fact, that Roch had managed to get more followers for his group. And many of the townspeople would either donate money or volunteer their time to help out around the store and the clinic. But when the group wasn't at the clinic, the girls in the group seemed to be competing with each other to get Roch to pay attention to them. They were pretty much just throwing themselves at him. But Giselle, remember Giselle? She was getting quite jealous of all the attention that Roch was getting from the young girls, so she took it upon herself to propose to Roch. Roch took a week to think about it and then accepted the offer. On January 8th, 1978, the group piled into their van. Everyone had a van in the 70s. And they made their way to Montreal, where Roch and Giselle were married at an Adventist church. But there was no honeymoon for the newly married couple. Instead, the group got back into the van and hit the road back to Ste. Marie. And for the duration of the 5-hour road trip, Roch was laughing and flirting with the other girls in the group, and Giselle spent the entire ride crying in the back of the van. Wow. When you try to explain what a dick smack is, this guy is the absolute definition of a dick smack. By the time the group had returned to Ste. Marie, Giselle had figured out that the whole purpose of the wedding and why it was held in Montreal was to suppress the concerns of Pierre Zita and the other elders of the church, not because he actually loved Giselle and wanted to marry her. She should have ran then. Even the illusion of a wonderful wedding wasn't enough to allay the concerns of Pierre Zita. He took it upon himself to go to some of the parents of the girls that were following Roch, and he tried to get the parents to bring their daughters home. Pierre even approached Giselle after the wedding and tried to get her to leave Roch, but nothing Pierre did or said was able to break the hold that Roch had over Giselle. At one point, the family of one of the girls called the police in Ste. Marie and asked them to get their daughter, who was in her 20s. The girl wouldn't even come outside to speak with the officers when they came to the clinic, and there was really nothing they could do. She was in her 20s. She was an adult. Roch was doing well, making money with the clinic, but he was keeping all the money for himself and not paying any of the bills around town. Businessmen started to complain to the police about the overdue bills, but the police really couldn't do anything about that. The businessmen that Roch owed money to would have to take him to court. In March of 1978, just 2 months after Roch and Giselle's marriage, a 38-year-old woman named Geraldine Auclair was admitted to the Healthy Living Clinic. Geraldine's husband had become a fan of Roch. Geraldine was undergoing leukemia treatments in Quebec City, and everything seemed to be going well for her recovery. But once Roch found out from her husband that she was undergoing these harsh treatments, he convinced the husband to let him visit Geraldine in the hospital in Quebec. Once at the hospital, Roch got into a screaming match with the doctors over the plan of care for Geraldine. Roch was convinced and was able to convince Geraldine's husband that the doctors were killing her with all the drugs they were giving her. So Geraldine was checked out of the hospital in Quebec City by her husband and Roch and brought to the clinic to receive a natural plan to combat leukemia. While Geraldine was undergoing Roch's natural treatment for leukemia, which, by the way, consisted of grape juice and other organic foods, no one was allowed to visit her, not even her own father, as any interruptions to the plan of care would jeopardize the healing process. As I'm sure it's no shock to any of you, Geraldine died in the clinic because grape juice just doesn't seem to have the leukemia fighting power that Roch thought it would. With the possibility looming that his followers might start doubting his powers of healing, Roch informed them that he had entered Geraldine's room and kissed her, which brought her back from the dead. But God wanted Geraldine in heaven, and when God wants his people, he takes them. So even though Roch had brought her back to life, God wanted her, and so it had been Geraldine's time to go with God. And they believed him. The charisma that this man must have had must have been just astronomical. Around the same time that Geraldine passed away, another girl, 19-year-old Gabrielle Nadeau, was brought to the clinic by her parents to be treated for her multiple sclerosis. Gabrielle's parents had met Roch at one of his anti-smoking workshops. Meanwhile, Pierre Zita was not happy with what Roch was doing and managed to get him voted out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church completely. You know there's a huge problem when you've been kicked out of an entire church. Roch received the news of being removed from the church, but it didn't faze him one little bit. In fact, Roch decided to kind of stick it back to the church and decided that 2 couples within his group would be married. The only thing was, though, that, well, number 1, Roch wasn't legally allowed to perform marriages, and number 2, the 2 women and the 2 men that Roch informed would be married were not couples, or had even remotely thought about pairing up with the other. The 2 couples that Roch chose were Claude and Solange, and Jacques and Nicole. Even though none of the chosen 4 were really interested in getting married, they agreed to the nuptials because they believed in Roch. If he told them to do something, they did it. Solange's family were Adventists, and they had been trying really hard to get her to leave Roch. So when Solange invited her parents to her upcoming wedding, their priest told them that they should go and show Solange that they still loved her and see if maybe she would come home with them. But to Solange's parents' dismay, the wedding went ahead. They reported back to the elders of the church that the ceremony was not what they had expected. Under-fucking statement of the year right there, folks. The ceremony was long and drawn out by Roch's ridiculously rambling speeches, where he stressed over and over that a woman's role was to be subservient to the man. Solange's mother wept through the speeches, and it wasn't because she was overjoyed to see her daughter marrying the man of her dreams. That spring, Giselle found herself pregnant and pretty much completely rejected by Roch. So she gave him an ultimatum. Either he'd disband the commune or she was leaving and moving back with her father. As I'm sure you can imagine, Roch didn't take the ultimatum well. His response was to punch Giselle in the mouth and lock her in a room for 2 days. What a shit snake. By June of 1978, the Healthy Living Clinic was in some serious trouble. With Roch keeping all the money that was coming in and not paying the bills, there were piles and piles of outstanding debt. After Geraldine had died inside the clinic, police had caught wind of it and placed the clinic under heavy surveillance. And because Roch had been removed from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he was no longer able to acquire their literature and supplies for the clinic and the missionary work, meaning there was no stock coming in. So Roch closed down the clinic and packed up the group and decided it was time to hit the road. The group piled into the vehicles and the convoy set out roaming from town to town for about a month. By July, the group ended up in the wilderness of the Gaspé Peninsula, which is in the southeast corner of Quebec and relatively close to the border of New Brunswick. It was here that Roch informed the group that he had had another vision and another message from God. He told his followers that the world was going to end on February 17th, 1979. He told them that giant boulder-size hail, earthquakes, and lightning would rain down on humanity, which in turn would end the world. He told them that they had a chance to become God's chosen ones, but they had to immediately set up a homestead in the shrubland of the Appalachian Mountains and live a pure and righteous life. Where they were when Roch got this message was at the base of the Appalachian mountain range. So wasn't that convenient that they were just right there? The group hiked up into the Appalachians for 2 days until they came upon a small lake called Lac Sec. In English, it would be called Dry Lake. Beside Dry Lake was a small hill, and Roch named it Eternal Mountain. Since Roch had determined that that was where they were going to build their utopia, he not only named the pile of rocks Eternal Mountain, but he also named his family, the Holy Moses Mountain family. The group set out to building the shelter. They started with a tent town and began construction on a commune building, one building for all of them to live in. Roch had these people working 17 hours a day and with very little food. If anyone complained that they were hungry, Roch would actually take portions of their food away as punishment for complaining. Unfortunately, Roch claimed that his old injury in his digestive system was acting up, and so he was unable to help with the physical labor. Of course, Roch also reminded the group that his role as spiritual leader and salvation seeker was much, much more important, and it was better that he focus on that while they do the heavy lifting. But this grueling schedule of all work and no food wasn't for all the members of the group. Yolande, who had joined the group at the retreat, stated that her passport had expired and she made her way back to France. Another follower, Leo Marc Fauché, and his wife and child, had joined the group at the Healthy Living Clinic. Leo had given Roch all of his money and possessions. But both Leo and his wife had had enough of this, so Leo and his family gathered up what little possessions they had, threw them into a homemade wagon, and headed back to find civilization on foot. Roch didn't do anything to stop these people from leaving, but he did use their departure to make sure that the group knew that the defectors were considered evil in the eyes of God and would lie dead for all of eternity once the end of the world came to pass. By 1978, the cabin was complete. There was a well in the center of the main room. The roof was made with logs covered in moss and twigs, and there were bedrooms off of the main room, all with bed sheets as doors. Of course, along with the new home, they all needed new names. So Roch assigned new names to everyone. All of the names came from the Old Testament. Roch picked Moses for himself, Moïse in French. Somehow, and I have no idea how they managed to do this, but everyone inside the cabin was collecting welfare from the government of Quebec. And with all the checks they received, the group had a total of $1,400 a month, which in today's money would be about $6,700. So they were doing all right for themselves. In October of 1978, Nicole, the one who had married Jacques, went to Giselle, and Giselle, by the way, is 6 months pregnant at this time, and informed Giselle that at one point while everyone was out working, she and Roch had had sex. Giselle ran out of the cabin in a rage, but Roch followed her, caught her, threw her to the ground, and began to strangle her until Giselle agreed to return to the house and be a good wife of the leader. After this incident, Roch declared to the group that any marriages that had taken place between commune members other than his to Giselle were immediately deemed null and void. And then he proceeded to marry all of the women in the group to himself. Of course, he had to consummate the new marriages. However, there was only one that he didn't force himself upon, and that was Gabrielle Nadeau, the girl whose parents had brought her to the clinic to heal her multiple sclerosis. According to reports, Solange was the last girl to become a wife of Roch. She held out as long as she possibly could, but sadly, eventually, Solange had to give in and wed Roch. On November 18, 1978, the Jonestown massacre happened in Guyana. Roch told his followers that he had had a vision prior to the killings that it was going to happen. Sure you did, Roch. Just as a tangent here, I have studied Jonestown and the People's Temple extensively for years, and I will do an episode on it, but it's going to be a 3 or 4-parter when I do. The story is absolutely tragic, but it's fascinating. Sorry, back to the case. The Jonestown massacre shocked and terrified the world, and specifically many of the family members of those living with Roch. Many went to the police begging for them to go up to the commune and bring back their daughters and sons. But the police's hands were tied. They had no evidence that directly connected Roch to any crime. So there was no way they could place him in custody or forcibly remove anybody from the commune that didn't want to go. But the police agreed to attend to the commune and see if they could do anything. But shockingly, when they went to the commune, Roch came out and went with them willingly and agreed to a psychological assessment. He stated to the investigators and the psychologists that he was not, in fact, the leader of a cult, and that actually the commune was a democracy. He told them that the members of the commune lived in peace and there was absolutely no promiscuity happening within the boundaries of the commune. Funnily enough, Roch omitted the parts about food rationing, physical, mental abuse at his own hands to all the others, and the fact that he had created his own personal harem and was actively sexually abusing the women. Those parts just slipped his mind. Funny, eh? The police knew that Roch was absolutely full of shit with his statements, but unfortunately, there was not one shred of evidence that he was a danger to himself or anyone else, especially since no one inside the commune would dare say anything against him, and none of them agreed to leave. Police had no choice but to release Roch back to the commune. And this was pretty much when Roch went off the rails. And I know you thought he was already off of them, but it gets much, much worse. Roch stopped eating the healthy diet as was to be followed by the doctrines of the Adventists. His diet pretty much consisted of junk food and meat, which, hey, if he wasn't a charismatic shit rat psychopath, I wouldn't see anything wrong with that diet. I would enjoy it. He actually used Gabrielle Laver as a prostitute to the owner of a local grocery in exchange for milk, meat, and cheese. Roch also began drinking again. He had been sober for 2 years, but first he introduced wine as a communion thing for the commune, and then that graduated to beer, and then cognac, and before anyone knew what was happening, Roch was completely off the wagon. Roch started preaching to the followers, delivering rambling, slurred speeches that would go on for hours. And if, God forbid, anyone made the mistake of falling asleep during one of Roch's speeches, well, Roch had the solution for that. A 4-inch thick club upside the head usually brought the person sleeping back to the land of the woke, and I'm sure was accompanied with a nice little concussion as well. One morning, one of Roch's many wives, Maurice, was pregnant, and she decided to take 2 extra pancakes, more than what Roch had allotted her for the day. As punishment, Roch broke 2 of her ribs by punching her in the side. After this punishment, Maurice began speaking about leaving the commune, and when Roch got wind of Maurice talking about leaving the commune, he instructed Jacques, who was actually legally Maurice's husband, to take an axe and chop off one of her toes for her sinful thoughts and speech. "No one leaves," Roch said. Jacques refused to carry out the punishment, which only enraged Roch, who then began taunting Jacques. "Don't you have any balls? If you want to be a man, you need to teach your woman a lesson." Jacques broke and began to sob uncontrollably. Roch took the axe and told both Jacques and Maurice that he was going to chop all of Maurice's toes off. Jacques reluctantly and through tears took the axe and chopped off one of Maurice's toes to spare her from losing all of them. After this incident happened, Jacques became Roch's main enforcer of punishments. Roch had favorite punishments that he liked to save for special occasions. One of these was to make the person strip naked and stand out in the snow for a few hours. And we're in Canada here, people. We can hit minus 40 Celsius up here in the winter. I'm actually shocked that no one died while standing out there. But thankfully, extreme frostbite was the worst of the injuries that came from that punishment. Jacques had had enough of Roch and his insane ways of running the commune, and he left. Of course, Roch told the others that Jacques had been taken over by Satan himself and, like the others who had deserted the commune, would lie dead for all of eternity, while the rest of them would bask in the light of God as the chosen ones. The punishments and talk of being a chosen one at the end of the world only helped to make the rest of the followers more obedient to Roch. Whenever a member had a thought or actually did something against Roch's rules, they would write letters to Roch begging for forgiveness and promising to fix their evil ways. This is a letter from Francine. Hello, Pappy. I am writing about what you said on the subject of nutrition. It is very true that I nibble, a damnable fault, which I will never again repeat. The thought of ingesting such a large quantity of food in so little time discourages me, even if I work outside the entire day without eating. I ask that you forgive me. If it is stealing, I did not realize it. It is this fault which causes my plumpness. I do not want to be a fat and plump servant. That is too ugly next to the man that you are. I don't know what to think about everything and the meaning of my actions. I only know that I will not repeat them, and I don't speak lightly. I wish to be a true servant to you, my master, alert, vigorous, with a clear and lively spirit and well balanced, to serve you every moment of my life. I have a long way to go. Thank you, Pappy. I love you. Hogla, which was the name that Roch had given Francine when he renamed all the followers. February 17th, 1979 arrived, and then it passed, and there were no earthquakes or giant boulders of hail or even lightning. Roch told his followers that because time passed differently for God than it did for mortals, it was difficult for him, the human representative of God, to get the exact right day and time. Amazingly, no one left the commune after the failed prediction of the end of the world. Roch told them all that he had to be pretty close to the correct date in his calculations, so really, the end could come any day now. Back in the world of civilization, one of the followers, Chantal, her parents were able to get a court order for a psychiatric evaluation on her. When 2 police officers arrived knocking on the door for Chantal, Roch was somehow able to sweet-talk them to leave without taking Chantal with them, which just goes to show how charismatic this man was. About a month after the end of the world was supposed to happen, the Quebec City newspaper published a story with the headline, "They are happy and free to leave if they wish." The article referred to Roch as the group's spiritual father, and there was even a quote from Jacques, who had left the group, stating that the commune was run democratically. Even after escaping, Jacques was still terrified of Roch and his reach. After the newspaper article and the failed attempt to take Chantal in for evaluations, 10 police officers landed inside a helicopter on Eternal Mountain. They arrested Roch for obstruction of justice. He was then ordered by the court to undergo more psychological evaluations in Quebec City. Giselle kept the home fires going while Roch was being evaluated. Many family members of the followers thought that this would be an opportune time to try and retrieve their loved ones from the commune, but when they arrived at the commune, Giselle made sure they knew their presence wasn't welcomed, and again, the family members were unsuccessful in saving their loved ones from the grip of Roch Theriault. Meanwhile, back at the hospital in Quebec City, Roch was blowing as much smoke up the doctors' asses as he possibly could. He told them that he had saved his followers from the streets, where they were nothing but dirty, drug-addicted thieves, and it was in fact him that had saved them all and put them on the right path to bettering themselves and their lives. Roch's charisma was so effective that the director of the hospital started calling him Moses, which was his chosen name within the cult. And the director even publicly condemned the public and the police for assuming that Roch was insane just because they had a different lifestyle. You would think that someone who was able to obtain the position of director of a hospital would be a little less naive and gullible than this guy was. But that is what these cult leaders have that pulls people in, right? It's just fascinating to me how so many well-educated people can be taken by these cult leaders. Roch was released early from the hospital and deemed fit to stand trial on the obstruction of justice charges, and literally deemed fit all around. which again is shocking. In the end, Roch was found guilty of obstruction of justice, but received a suspended sentence, and he was free to return to his commune. Chantal, who had also been taken for a court-ordered evaluation, was also deemed to be of sound mind, and she too returned to the commune. Because of the glowing report from the director of the hospital, the media started portraying Roch as a gentle mountain man who had been wrongfully judged by a prejudiced society, which in turn only solidified his followers' beliefs that he was a messenger of God. And it had another, well, let's just say pretty bad effect. The public started making the pilgrimage to the commune just to see this apparent gentle mountain man and his followers in their peaceful, democracy-loving lifestyle, which only bolstered Roch's ego. In October of 1979, Gabrielle Nadeau slipped into a coma and died shortly after. Gabrielle's multiple sclerosis wasn't cured by Roch's holistic healing and calorie deprivation. Roch wanted to bury Gabrielle at the foot of Eternal Mountain, but the authorities caught wind of her death and took her body back to undergo an autopsy. The autopsy showed no signs of foul play of any kind, just that Gabrielle had succumbed to her disease. Which I think Roch knew she was going to pass away from multiple sclerosis, and that's why he never touched her. In November of 1980, Guy Vier joined the commune. Guy was the first new member since the group had left the clinic. Guy had been a patient at the same hospital that Roch was taken to for his mental evaluations, and when Guy heard about Roch and the commune, he decided to head into the hills to find them. Giselle examined Guy to ensure that he wasn't bringing in some horrible disease from the outside world into their sanctuary, and once he passed, he was welcome to stay. But because he was new, he had to live in a storage shed away from Roch and his harem. The group gave Guy a wood stove, 24 bottles of homemade beer, 2 hens, a rooster, and 1 meal a day. In return for this life of luxury, Guy was required to chop wood, assist with storing the food rations for the winter, and had to help build the extensions onto Roch's main cabin. In addition to all these other daily chores, Guy was responsible for babysitting the 3 children who lived inside the commune who had not been fathered by Roch. Roch declared Guy mentally unstable to the group and deemed Guy only good enough to care for the animals, that is, the children who weren't the seed of Roch. So in this group of children that Roch so lovingly referred to as the animals, we have 2-year-old Samuel and his sister Miriam and Simon, who was also 2. At that same time, there were also 3 other children living in the commune, but those 3 children had been fathered by Roch, so they weren't considered animals in Roch's eyes. On March 23, 1980, Roch and the members of the group were preparing for a celebration. Well, all the members except Guy, of course, the shed man. Roch was celebrating because his 2 sons from his first wife, Francine, were coming to live with him at the commune, Roch Jr., who was 12, and Francois, who was 10. Guy was instructed to take the quote-unquote animals to his shed and watch them while the rest of the group celebrated. Now, there are 2 different versions of what happened that night, and trigger warning, this is awful, like horrifically awful. The official version that was stated in the court documents was, according to the court records, stated by Guy and most of the commune members. This version states that 2-year-old Samuel was crying and Guy wasn't able to sleep. Not being able to sleep when he was so physically exhausted caused Guy to lose his temper and start screaming at little Samuel. And when the screaming didn't work, he picked Samuel up by the throat and punched the little boy in the face 5 or 6 times. You fucking piece of refuse. I don't know how anybody could do that to a 2-year-old. The next morning, Roch found out what happened to little Samuel and took him to Gabrielle, who was the nurse for the commune. Not the Gabrielle who died from multiple sclerosis. That was Gabrielle Nadeau. This is Gabrielle Laver, who is the nurse for the commune. According to testimony, Samuel's head was flopping all over the place, and his penis had begun to swell, so much so that urine couldn't come out. Graphic warning here, folks. Roch took a pair of scissors, sterilized them in alcohol, and then lanced the tip of Samuel's penis to allow urine to flow out. The next morning, 2-year-old little Samuel was found dead. Now that was the account that the courts accepted and placed into the court record. But according to the book Savage Messiah by Paul Kaihla and Ross Laver, Giselle had a different account of what happened that day. Giselle stated that the day after Guy punched Samuel in the face, Samuel's face was severely bruised, but there was nothing else wrong with him. According to Giselle, Roch decided that March 24th, the day after the beating, would be the day that Samuel needed to be circumcised. Roch brought a bottle of 94% ethanol solution to sterilize the razor, and then he squeezed some of the alcohol into Samuel's mouth as a kind of anesthetic for the child. Giselle believed that by giving the 2-year-old the ethanol that, in fact, Samuel had died by alcohol poisoning. Sadly, I don't think we'll ever really know what happened to little Samuel, but I lean towards the first version. Maurice was told about her son's death, but because Samuel had been deemed an outsider by Roch, the death didn't bother her. She just went back to work. Later in the day, Roch decided that the child's remains should be burned to avoid any animals digging in the ground and finding them. Maurice and Jacques agreed, and Claude set the child's body ablaze. After a couple of minutes, life went back to usual within the commune, as if nothing had happened. I know that the followers of the cult were victims, but my God, that was their son. What absolute fucking shit snakes. This makes me so mad. They disposed of that baby like they would kitchen garbage. The only reason Roch wanted that baby's body burned was so that he couldn't be held responsible. He is an absolute piece of shit. He's a monster, and it's just going to get worse. The commune seemed to be running smoothly for about 6 months. Well, smoothly if you consider physical, emotional, and mental abuse all mixed in with deprivation of nutrition and overworked people to be the status quo, right? But then one night in September 1980, Roch was drinking, and for some reason he decided that Guy had to be punished for the crime of punching Samuel in the face. Roch decided that they would hold a trial for Guy. Roch appointed Jacques to be the judge. Now remember, there were 2 Jacques inside the commune. The Jacques that left was not Maurice's husband. The Jacques that stayed was. Jacques was Samuel's biological father. Giselle was appointed to the position of prosecution. Claude was to be the defense lawyer for Guy. Gabrielle would be the coroner, and the other 6 wives of Roch would be the jury. This doesn't sound like a game I would want to play, no matter which position I was assigned to. Like, no fucking way. If I was Guy, I would have been terrified as this was being set up. The trial game lasted for a little over an hour, with testimony from all being heard, and then the jury came in with its verdict. Guy was found not guilty by reason of insanity. But Roch wasn't happy with the verdict of the trial, and so after stewing on it for a couple of hours, Roch approached Jacques, who had been the judge, and told him that the two of them were going to castrate Guy. Jacques wasn't too enthusiastic about the idea of castrating a grown man, so Roch called the commune members together and held a vote. Sadly, there were only 3 who voted against the castration: Jacques, Maurice, and Giselle. Everyone else who was in the commune thought it was an appropriate punishment for Guy. Guy, however, was not at all convinced that castration was an appropriate punishment, but Roch pulled Guy aside and somehow convinced him that by having the castration done, it would 100% cure the headaches that Guy had been suffering from. And not just that, but castration would also cure the excessive masturbation that Guy was guilty of. I just fucking bet it would. Mamma mia. And by the way, Roch also informed Guy that the excessive masturbation that he was doing was also causing the respiratory issues that he had been suffering from. And then, just to put the cherry on top of the sale for castration for Guy, Roch told him that as it stood within the hierarchy of the group, Guy was at the bottom as a slave. But if he got the castration, he would then become a eunuch, which would move him up the ladder of the commune. Roch had Guy write a letter of consent, but insisted that Guy did not have to sign it if he didn't want to. But Guy signed the letter, and with that, Guy was sold and hopped up on the table to let the nutshells fly. Nurse Gabrielle was instructed to go and fetch the needed medical instruments for the procedure. She came back with an elastic band, a razor blade, a magnifying glass, a pair of tweezers, and some ethanol. According to Guy, the procedure was actually painless, but his scrotum bled for a week afterwards. However, Nurse Gabrielle took very good care of Guy, changing the salt water compress on what was left of his manhood every 20 minutes, and increasing Guy's portion of iron-rich foods to keep his strength up. Miraculously, Guy never complained of a headache, ever again. But even with the castration and the promotion from slave to eunuch, Roch still felt that Guy was a security risk, and he began tormenting him. Roch would beat him and relentlessly berate him, but he would also make up games where the other commune members had to stab Guy in the chest in order to try and make him bleed to death. Once they had managed to weaken Guy, Roch, I'm going to just start calling him Roch because I've called him Roch so much, and he is a fucking roach. Once they had managed to weaken Guy, Roch would call the followers off and let Guy regain his strength, only to start the sadistic game all over again. On November 5th, 1979, Guy escaped out of the commune and made it to the village of Saint-Jacques. Once he found someone to take him in, he told them that a baby had died at the commune after being kicked by a horse. Police raided the commune and arrested Roch and Jacques and Maurice, Samuel's parents, and police were able to find some of Samuel's remains. Children's Aid attended the raid and apprehended the remaining 7 children and placed them in foster homes. When questioned, the remaining commune members quite nonchalantly informed the investigators that Guy had beaten the child. No one was even upset at the prospect that the police were questioning them about a baby's death. Next, during the search, investigators found the letter of consent that Guy had signed for the castration. But even that didn't faze the members of the group. They answered all the questions regarding the incident as if they were discussing the price of bread at a store. Samuel's remains were sent to the coroner to try and determine cause of death. The coroner came back stating that it was determined that Samuel's death was not natural and that Roch's group were responsible for the child's death. Roch, Jacques, Maurice, Gabrielle, and Guy were all charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm to Samuel. Claude, the one who actually burned Samuel's body, was charged with obstruction of justice. In addition to those charges, Jacques and Maurice were charged with neglect toward their oldest daughter Miriam, and Claude and Solange were also charged with neglect towards their son Simon. As well, Roch and Gabrielle were also charged with bodily harm with intent to mutilate. That charge was for the castration of Guy. When they finally got to court, everyone pled not guilty. Shocker. Jacques, Maurice, Claude, Solange, and Guy were released on the condition that none of them were to return to the commune. Roch and Gabrielle, however, were denied bail because the judge felt that they were a possible danger to society. You think? The group members' trial finally came up through the court system, and it ended up being 9 months long. The trial was held in the town of New Carlisle. And during the trial, all of the followers that were still at the commune moved to the town to show support for their fellow members and for their leader. In the end, everyone was found guilty. Maurice and Solange were sentenced to 3 years probation. Jacques and Claude received 6 months in prison and 3 years of probation. Guy was sentenced, but later would be acquitted for mental incompetence and was sent back to l'Hôpital Robert Griffin. Gabrielle was sentenced to 9 months in prison and 3 years probation for her part in Samuel's death, and Roch was sentenced to 2 years less a day in prison and 3 years probation for each of the charges he had, and the sentences were to be served concurrently. Roch was sent to Orsainville Detention Center in Quebec City. I don't know if I said that right. Which meant the followers were moving again. This time they rented 4 apartments in Quebec City and spread themselves out between them. They had to be close to their leader. Meanwhile, back at the commune on Eternal Mountain, police burned that bitch to the ground and bulldozed the ashes. The Holy Moses Mountain family was finally no more. But in fact, it was not the end. It was just the beginning. While Roch was sitting in prison, he began taking notes for a book that he decided he was going to write. The book was later published in Quebec City in November of 1983, and it was entitled L'Affaire Moise. And good luck finding it. I couldn't find it, but it was published while he was still in prison. Roch was released from prison in February of 1984, and not only had he been busy in prison working on his book, he also had other projects he was working on. Of course, the followers were all there when he was released, and they suggested to Roch that they all find a house to rent where they could live together, but Roch had another idea. He informed the group that they were headed to Ontario and were going to go back into the bush and start all over again. In May of 1984, the group made their way to Somerville Township, Burnt River, Ontario, which is just east of Barrie and literally in the middle of nowhere. Burnt River is a very tiny village. It's like a corner, and that's about all there is out there. Roch informed the group that he had stopped drinking again, so there would be no more violence amongst them. He also stated that as God's messenger, they were obligated to follow him wherever he went, unless they wanted to lay dead for all eternity. Oh, and he had changed his name again. Now he was calling himself Roch, which was just the anglicized version of Roche. I personally think they should have gone for something a little more, I don't know, what is the word? Shit snaky, perhaps? The group began construction on a new cabin, a new commune, in fact. This one was an A-frame cabin and had 2 stories, a little different when compared to the old one, but just as isolated. Inside the commune, there was a kitchen, a bakery, a maple sugar shack, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a stone sanctuary or altar upon which Roch would commune with God. The group now consisted of 2 male and 9 female followers, 4 of whom were pregnant, and all of whom were responsible for the 10 children ranging in age from 1 to 15. They worked through the summer wearing long pants and sweaters to keep the mosquitoes and black flies away. Have you ever been bitten by a black fly? Oh my God, those things are vicious. They just take chunks out of you. Man, I hate black flies. Roche had created a new hierarchy for the group. For his wives, he assigned different ranks and responsibilities, the lowest of which was Maurice. Roche informed both Maurice and Jacques, who, remember, are actually legally married, that they would no longer be allowed to sleep together. And if Maurice was to get out of line or talk back in any way, Jacques was to beat her savagely. And Jacques followed these orders, even though Maurice was pregnant. A little time after this had been stated about beating Maurice, Roche informed Jacques that a birthmark that Maurice had on her body appeared to be like the number of the beast, 666, and she was then banished to live in her own little hut on the property with 2 of her children. Later, Roche took Maurice's oldest daughter, Miriam, into the group. But there was absolutely no inkling to outsiders that there was this strict regime reigning over the group. To the public, the group were just weird, eccentric, and very hardworking people who lived a little differently than everyone else. And no one in Ontario knew anything about what had happened in Quebec. The group tried to acquire funding, the same as they had in Quebec, but there were different laws at the time in Ontario, and the group was refused all funding. Basically, the provincial government identified the group as an institution and not a family. Roche was pissed. So pissed that he decided that if the government wouldn't give them what they needed and wanted, they would take it. So he started sending out his wives to steal from the local grocery stores in the nearby town of Lindsay, which is a little bit bigger than Burnt River. They even sewed jackets with giant pockets on the inside for the women to stash what they stole. On January 31st, 1985, Jacques was caught shoplifting. And very shortly after he was caught, Gabrielle Claude Nicole and Roche Jr., who, by the way, at the time of his arrest, had 50 feet of rope coiled around his waist, were all caught shoplifting. And between them, they had almost $500 in goods inside their jackets. Their sentence was to be banned from shopping in Lindsay ever again. So they were literally kicked out of the city. Back in the good old days, you could be banned from a town or a city. It doesn't happen anymore, but I'm thinking maybe we should bring that one back. With the shoplifting out of play, Roche told his followers to ask their parents for money to help sustain the group. But that was also a dead end. The few parents who were willing to give money to their children all said the same thing. If their child left the group and came home, they could have whatever they wanted. But none of the followers took up the offers from their parents, and all stayed with Roche. Roche had to come up with another plan, and so he decided to sell the wares of the group: crafts, fruits, vegetables, all sorts of things. He created a company, and he called that company the Anthill Kids, because they all, according to Roch, worked together like a colony of ants. At least, that is what he told the public when asked about the name of the business. In reality, things were much different. The business took off like wildfire and was very popular. Money started rolling in. But as Roch started making money, he became increasingly bored. And as he became bored, he started drinking again. He completely stopped working, using his stomach pains as an excuse to not help. He prescribed himself a case of beer for all of his pain. And when he was drunk, he'd often go on at length about his treasures, which consisted of some worthless costume jewelry. The rest of the group was too terrified to do anything but pretend to be fascinated in whatever he was rambling about. He would also play the wives off of each other, manipulating their self-esteem to intrigue him and keep him not so bored. He would organize no-holds-barred nude wrestling matches between the women, or he would put a man in the middle of a circle and tell the women to hit and kick him. Sometimes he would join in the matches, but then the rules would change. If you scored a hit on him, it would come out of your food rations for the day. Sometimes he would just beat or whip his followers, or strike them with the flat side of an axe or a hammer. Sometimes he would urinate on them, or just for fun, have them smear themselves with each other's feces. And one time he slashed Jacques' jugular with a broken wine glass. They were all forbidden to go to the hospital ever if they ever had an injury. Shortly after the slash of Jacques' jugular, who recovered, he ordered Jacques to be circumcised. All of these assaults that Roch did on his followers had like a cathartic effect on them. According to the followers, Roch had punished them for their sins, and they were now purified as a result. And every time anything would happen, Roch would weep the next day, after all the alcohol had left his system. He would put on a grand show for the followers, screaming and crying and begging God, his master, to stop using him as a vehicle for cruel justice that the followers were deserving of. So he's in front of all of these people after he's pissed on them and beaten them and sliced their throats and circumcised them. He's sitting there crying his eyes out, saying God made him do it because he is the vessel of God. The man is a fucking shit rat. On January 26, 1985, shortly after 9 a.m., Gabrielle Laver put her 5-month-old baby son, Elizar, in a wheelbarrow and pushed him outside the cabin. The son was Roch's son, and Roch had basically hated the child from when it was born. Roch claimed that the child bore the mark of the devil, and he had often beaten the baby. Gabrielle thought that by letting the baby freeze to death, it would be an act of mercy for the infant. That day it was snowing, and the temperature was minus 10 degrees Celsius. That's 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And by 10:45 a.m., Elizar was dead. The county coroner, Al Lackey, who was, of course, a friend of Roch's, claimed that it had been sudden infant death syndrome. But the County Children's Aid Society was suspicious and began watching the commune closely. Around this time, Maurice, who had been banished to her own little hut, was allowed to leave the commune, but she was only allowed to take 2 of her 3 children. Her eldest, Miriam, would have to stay as she was slated to be Roch's next wife. You see, Miriam was just about to hit puberty. which in Roch's eyes made her ready to be his wife and bear him children. Fucking shit pig. Ugh. Maurice left and had to leave Miriam there, but a few months after being back in the real world, she decided to start legal action against Roch to get Miriam back. During the legal action, Maurice had to testify as to what was happening inside the walls of the Ant Hill Kids commune. CAS caught wind of the horrible things happening to the kids and raided the commune and apprehended the children, all of them. Once the kids were in foster care, the whole truth started to come out. Roch had separated the children of the compound into two groups: his own, chosen children, who enjoyed a privileged position within the commune, and those who were not his own, particularly the children of Maurice and Simon, who was Solange and Claude's son. Those kids were considered animals or slaves in Roch's eyes. And of course, the followers agreed with the labels that Roch had put upon these children. Roch saw to the care of his own children. Guy had been allowed to join the group for the sole purpose of looking after the outsider animal children. By the time that the kids were rescued, Maurice's children crawled like animals and were severely malnourished. The rest of the commune were forbidden to speak with any of them, so the children's communication skills were almost non-existent. In fact, one could argue that those kids were one step above feral. For the rest of the children, the ones fathered by Roch, only Roch himself was allowed to show any type of affection towards them. Roch used the children as pawns in games to gain control over his wives. He would hold two of the children over a fire and threaten to throw one of them in the fire. He loved watching the women scream and beg for their children. It not only boosted his ego, but it also solidified that he was in charge through fear, and he knew they would never leave on their own. When a child had done something wrong, like take a bit more food than they were supposed to, Roch would nail the child to a tree by their clothing and then tell the other children to throw stones at the child or try and stab the child with knives. He would wait until the very last possible second and call off the attacking children. It was just another way for Roch to solidify his position of authority amongst both the children and the followers. The majority of the children's teeth had rotted away, as there was no dental hygiene within the commune. Some would randomly scream instead of using speech because the only form of education was that of Roch's curriculum, which only included religion and sex education. Roch told the kids that God lived underground, and they knew this because the flowers grew up from the ground. He also told the children that God sometimes needed blood sacrifices. In one ritual that Roch performed just for the children, he sacrificed a goat that one of his daughters had raised from a baby, and then bathed himself in the goat blood. So it wasn't only Maurice's children that were just above feral. And just like the adult followers, the children were deprived of sleep, being made to do chores around the commune at all hours of the day and night. Trigger warning for this next part. There is talk of sexual abuse and rape of children here. If you don't want to hear this, skip ahead 10 seconds. The children reported that the entire commune would have family sex, and that Roch and his son, Roch Jr., would sexually abuse the children during the family sex time. Both of these shit pigs would have the children perform sexual acts on them, all while telling the children that this was how God wanted the chosen ones to have sex. The courts ordered an independent assessment be performed on the children immediately, but that assessment was conducted by a Dr. Riel Theriault. I don't know if I said that right, and I don't care because he's a shit pig, who, P.S., was a really good friend of Roch's. and a Dr. Martin Milkovich. The final report that was created by these two pieces of shit doctors recommended that the children be returned to Burnt River immediately. In their 300-page report, they celebrated Roch's pioneering spirit and experimental attitude regarding sexual education. They accused the government of trying to persecute the group, trying to force them to disband by withholding welfare, a gross infraction of their rights as citizens. What? Are you fucking kidding me? I'm telling you, this Roch Theriault had the reach of Jim Jones. I'm telling you. How does he know and control this many people, even outside the commune? It's literally terrifying to think that this actually happened. It's insane. This story just shocked me from beginning to end. During this same time, the CAS launched its own investigation. And now, normally I have huge problems with the CAS, and I hate them. P.S. CAS is Children's Aid Society, which in the States I believe is called Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS. This is our version of that. The Canadian CAS system is the most broken system inside this country. And sadly, it is the one system that is supposed to protect our children. Those two things should not be together in any way, shape, or fucking form. The system protecting our innocent children should not be broken. And yet, it is. And no one will do anything about it. It's pathetic. But, luckily, and only luckily this one time, the CAS had launched its own investigation. But every time someone from the CAS attended the commune, it was like Roch had this power of, I don't know, disillusionment. It's like the Force in Star Wars. These aren't the droids you're looking for. There's nothing going on here. The children are fine and healthy. It was insane. And some CAS workers became advocates for Roch's way of life. But in the end, thank God, not all the CAS agents went to the commune and were disillusioned by Roch. And the final report recommended that all children be apprehended from the commune and made wards of the Crown. On October 26, 1987, the court ruled that the children of the commune of the Anthill Kids be made wards of the Crown. There was to be no parental access, as the court believed Roch to be a manipulative despot who posed a significant risk of molestation and exploitation. Finally, the 83-page court ruling also suggested that the testimonies of those two shit rat doctors, Hunot and Mikovich, and the sympathetic CAS agents were nothing more than the result of a cultural prejudice of sympathy for French-speaking community inside a predominantly English environment. And that was the reason that all these people were sympathetic to Roch, instead of being concerned for the welfare of the children of a group. Even with the children being apprehended, there still wasn't enough physical evidence to press criminal charges against Roch. They needed a witness, but Maurice, who had left, wasn't willing to testify against Roch. And I don't blame her. I would be hiding in a hole somewhere and never sticking my head out even for air. And it's about this time that Roch discovered the Mormon fundamentalist movement. And this was how he met up with a forensic psychiatrist and LDS branch president, Dr. Jess Grossbeck. Grossbeck specialized in cases of altered consciousness and dissociative disorders. He was also drawn to shamanism and polygamy. He and Roch obviously became really good friends. Roch also met Alex Joseph of Big Water, Utah, who was also a polygamist, But Joseph didn't really care for Roch's attitude. Just keep that part in the back of your mind. Back at the commune, home life wasn't getting any better. It only took a few beers to get Roch going on about the master of life and death, the good and bad creator. One day he became enraged at Claude for some reason, no one knows why, and ordered him to walk around with an elastic band wrapped tightly around his scrotum. Claude kept it on overnight, which caused irreparable damage to his testicles, which of course prompted Roch to operate. Trigger warning, graphic coming up. He used a razor blade to cut open Claude's scrotum and pulled out the infected testicle with his fingers. And then he cauterized the wound with a hot piece of iron. Okay, even that made my voice go up a few octaves, because the pain that man must have felt, oh my God. After Roch was done doing his quote-unquote surgery on Claude, he held a vote within the commune to determine whether Claude should be stoned to death for offending God. Luckily, the members of the commune voted not to stone Claude to death. Even with the members saying don't kill him, Roch picked up an acetylene, I think it's acetylene. I don't know how to say this word, but an acetylene torch, which is a fucking welding torch. You know those really scary looking things that blast fire out of the end in a narrow, hot line of fire? Yeah, he picked up one of those and threatened to cut open Claude's stomach. The man is a fucking psycho. Claude managed to escape into the woods, where he stayed until Roch was sober again. This became common practice for many people in the group to go and hide in the woods until Roch sobered up. One night in February 1987, Roch threw a hunting knife at Giselle, creating a wound 3 inches deep in her thigh, which immediately began gushing blood. Roch's response was to go and get another beer and go lay down. After a 2-hour power nap, a clot had formed in Giselle's leg, which had swollen. Roch decided to operate. He started pressing Giselle's leg to cause the wound to reopen, and started probing it with a red-hot iron file and pouring cup after cup of boiling water on her leg. A week later, the wound, shockingly, was infected. Roch decided to fill the wound with salt, olive oil, and spruce gum. After Giselle's leg had healed a bit, she tried to escape the commune, but a few days later she went back to Roch. Giselle believed that she had to stay with her husband. After all, it was her role in God's plan. Anywhere she would go, Roch would find her and convince her to come back. Other incidents of Roch's drinking pastimes. He once took the welding torch and ran it along a girl's back until her skin bubbled. When Nicole gave birth to one of his children, he passed that same fucking torch over her stomach to purify her womb for her next child. Would someone please take the fucking welding torch away from this moron? Oh my God. And it just gets worse from there. This man was a sick fuck. In fact, I don't know if there are horrible enough words to describe this piece of shit. I'm just going to list all the horrible things he did to his followers, and instead of talking about each one individually, I'm just going to list them really, really fast, like ripping off a Band-Aid, because, trigger warning, this is going to be horrific. And while I'm listing them, just think about how even with all these horrible things that Roch did to them, his followers never left him. And he told them that most of these things that he was doing was God's justice for the sins that they committed. His followers were so physically, mentally exhausted and brainwashed by this point that they didn't fight back or question anything, and many of them didn't even cry out in pain. They took it because they felt they deserved it. Just think about that while I read this list. Are you ready? Here we go. He hit Jacques in the head with a blunt axe and broke his ribs with a wooden club. He punched his own son, Roch Jr., in the face when Roch Jr. refused to wrestle with his brother. He beat Nicole 3 months pregnant, causing her to miscarry. On another occasion, he shot a .303 caliber bullet through Nicole's shoulder. He broke Giselle's ribs with his steel-toed boots. One time he punched Solange in the neck so hard he knocked her unconscious. He threw knives at both Francine and at Maurice. He broke Solange's cheekbone when she was 6 months pregnant. He placed vice grips on the nipples of some of his wives and squeezed until the skin would break and the nips would bleed. Not the nips, never the nips. Oh God, I hate that one. He beat one of the horses to death with a chain and ordered Claude to burn the body of the horse. You don't fucking mess with horses. Now I hate you even more than I did before. But even with all that, it seems that Claude and Gabrielle Lavallee suffered the most at the hands of Roch's sadistic mind. He purposely sprained Claude's toes, and I don't even know how he did it, but I don't even want to think about how he did it. Another time, Roch used a piece of broken glass to slice Claude's arm open. He pulled 11 of Claude's healthy teeth out of his mouth with a pair of pliers. He forced one of his wives to break Claude's legs with a sledgehammer. He hog-tied Claude and suspended him from the ceiling for an hour. He poured boiling water on him, and another time, he made Claude sit on a lit stove. He also shot a .22 caliber rifle at Claude and hit him. For Gabrielle, he squeezed her hand in a vice until it broke. He whipped Gabrielle in the eye with his belt. He stuck a hypodermic needle in her back with God only knows what solution inside of it. And after injecting the whatever solution was in it, he twisted the needle until the tip broke off under her skin. He burned Gabrielle's breasts and genitals with the welding torch. He had Jacques cut off half of Gabrielle's left baby finger with a pair of wire cutters. He broke Gabrielle's fingers with a board. He made her cut a hole in the ice of one of the ponds and jump in the freezing water as a cleansing ritual. He also had Jacques pound Gabrielle's thigh with sledgehammers. And this is the absolute worst thing ever in my life. And it's graphic, so I would skip ahead if you don't want to hear it. Gabrielle's uterus prolapsed, meaning it was falling out of her body literally through her vagina. Roch tried to push the uterus back inside Gabrielle by punching the uterus. Once he was able to get the uterus somewhat back inside her body, he took a piece of wood and carved it into a cone and used that to plug up her vagina so that the uterus wouldn't fall out again. Gabrielle escaped during the night and managed to get to a woman's shelter in the nearby town, but they wanted to take her to a doctor, and Roch's brainwashing was still powerful. Gabrielle was so terrified as to what Roch would do to her if she went to a doctor, she fled from the woman's shelter and went back to the commune. A couple of days later, the uterus had still not made it back to where it was supposed to be. So Roch tied a string around the piece that was outside of Gabrielle's body and tried to pull it out like a loose tooth. And because that didn't work either, Roch put his wooden cone back in place, and Gabrielle suffered like that for almost a year. A year. Oh my God. I'm surprised she lived. Roch had started going to Utah on extended trips to spend time with his new Mormon friends and do God only knows what down there. So during one of his many trips to Utah, this was when Gabrielle was able to make it to a doctor, and they gave her an emergency partial hysterectomy. And she was able to get back to the commune before Roch knew what was happening. This guy is a fucking monster. And even with all these horrible things happening, no one inside the commune thought ill of Roch. They didn't blame him at all for anything that he did to them. He had them absolutely convinced that whenever he doled out these punishments, as he called them, they were just justices from God for their sins. By the way, the sins that we're talking about are taking an extra minute or two of rest when they should have been working, or grabbing an extra little bit of rice at a meal because they were starving. Just as an example of how brainwashed these people were, here is a letter from Solange to Roch. Good day, Moses, my master. I would have liked to have talked to you yesterday evening, but I think it's preferable to write these things down rather than saying them for fear of talking too much. I am going to talk to you about the last fit of anger that your master exercised through you. I really believe that what you did doesn't come from you, but from someone much higher. For my part, I really believe that you were possessed by a very powerful spirit. That's what I saw in what you did. The throwing of the knife, the rifle shot, the harm done to Mammy. My eyes saw things that went beyond them. My body is very afraid of all these things. I understand it very well because of the law of death in which it exists. But within myself I am well. I am very well and very happy to belong to a real master, who himself belongs to the only real master of life. Love, Rachel, which was Solange's new name that Roch gave her. The amount of brainwashing just inside that letter alone is just over the top. Absolutely over the top. By the fall of 1988, Solange had begun to feel ill. Roch informed her that there was something wrong with her liver and that she would have to have an operation. A few days later, Roch was 3 sheets to the wind, like he was falling down pissed. He was strangling some of his wives and telling them that their breath belonged to him, as if he were just passing the time. Then he stopped and proceeded to start donning his elaborate jewelry that he wore during ceremonies. He turned to Solange and told her that he was going to treat her for the issues in her liver. He took Solange and laid her down on the long wooden table used for baking bread. To begin the procedure, he gave Solange an enema of molasses, oil, and water. But the concoction was too thick for its intended purpose, so Roch started punching Solange in the stomach to make the concoction come back out. Solange put her hands over her stomach in defense of the blows, to which Roch simply said, "Put your hands down." Solange, most likely terrified at this point, did as she was told. Once that was over, he inserted a tube down her throat and instructed the rest of the followers to blow and then suck air in and out of the tube, telling them they would be breathing for Solange during the surgery. They all complied. Roch then made an incision with a kitchen knife on Solange's right side below her ribs. Once he had her body open, he removed a large piece of tissue by ripping it from the inside of her body. He held the body tissue in the air and cried, "There, you are healed." He then ordered Gabrielle Laver to sew Solange back up. Roch then instructed the wives to take Solange and give her a warm bath filled with sherry. but the bath just made Solange feel worse. So Roch picked her up and dumped her into a freezing cold tub of water, then put her to bed. Solange was bleeding internally from Roch's so-called healing, and shortly after she was taken to bed, she died. An autopsy conducted later would determine that Solange died from acute peritonitis, an inflammation of the peritoneum caused by digestive fluids leaking into the abdominal cavity. In English, the peritoneum is a layer of tissue that surrounds your abdominal organs. The tissue that Roch pulled from Solange was most likely her peritoneum, which basically, by removing it, allowed digestive fluids, which are saliva, mucus, hydrochloric acid, enzymes, and bile, to seep into where her internal organs were. At first, Roch was distraught and tried killing himself in a number of ways. He tried to get Jacques to shoot him, then he tried to overdose on Tylenol, and finally he tried to drown himself. But then, according to a letter Roch wrote to the spirit of the deceased, a strange force entered my arms and tore the bindings from me. I came out of the water yelling, "God doesn't want me to die." In October of 1988, Roch returned to the commune after one of his extended trips to Utah and ordered Claude to exhume Solange's body. He had Gabrielle open Solange's body and pour vinegar on her internal organs to keep worms away. Then they buried her again. A few days later, he had them dig Solange up again. Her body was beginning to decay. Roch made Jacques cut a hole in Solange's skull with a hand drill. He then pleasured himself into the hole in her skull, convinced that by doing so, he would be able to resurrect her. But it didn't work. Fucking monster. Giselle told Roch that Solange's wish had been to be cremated, and Roch agreed. But before the cremation, he had Gabrielle remove one of Solange's ribs, which Roch kept in a leather wrapping to carry around with him. After the cremation, everyone took some of the bones to keep. Roch collected some fragments and put them in a jar with olive oil as a preservative. By the winter of 1988, Roch had, if you can believe it, fathered more children, which he was able to keep hidden from the CAS. One of the children he took to Utah and gave to his friend Alex, the polygamist out there. It was during this time that one of the followers, Jose, left the commune for good. He was also somehow able to keep Solange's murder hidden from both the police and Solange's family. On July 26, 1989, Roch got drunk. Giselle, Claude, Francine, and Maurice all managed to sneak away into the woods and hide until he sobered up. They were even more afraid of him now, especially after what had happened to Solange. But sadly, Gabrielle wasn't able to sneak out of the commune. During one of his many drunken rants, Roch remembered that Gabrielle had a stiff pinky finger. He informed her that she was to be healed. He told Gabrielle to place her hand on the kitchen table while he picked up a large hunting knife. He studied the pinky finger for a moment and then brought the large knife down in one swift movement, right into the back of Gabrielle's hand. He brought the knife down with such force that he had pinned Gabrielle to the table through her hand with the knife. Blood began to drip out of the wound and run across the table. Roch looked at the wound and then at Gabrielle, and then rose and went and retrieved another beer. Gabrielle was stuck to the table and growing weaker by the second, but she willed herself to stay conscious. After 45 minutes, Roch returned to the kitchen and looked at Gabrielle's arm, which by this time had turned blue. "It's not looking too good, is it?" he asked her. He then picked up a carpet knife and began to whittle away at her upper arm like her flesh was the branch off of a birch tree. He just kept slashing at her arm until the bone was showing. When he was finally finished, the upper portion of Gabrielle's arm had no flesh left at all, just a bone. Roch then pulled the knife out of the back of Gabrielle's hand that was pinning her to the table. He grabbed hold of the bottom part of Gabrielle's arm, the part that was bloody flesh, and pulled her over to a stump in the corner of the kitchen. He placed her on her knees and pulled the arm across the stump. He picked up a meat cleaver and swung at the bone that was exposed on the top of Gabrielle's arm. He was so drunk he missed her arm completely with the first swing. But the second swing was more accurate, and Roch was able to cut through the bone and amputate Gabrielle's left arm completely from her body. The entire time, Gabrielle never so much as made a whisper of a sound. A couple of days after the nightmarish amputation, Roch decided that Gabrielle's stump was infected and had turned gangrenous. He used a pair of scissors to remove the infection on her stump. He also cut a large chunk of flesh from her left breast, telling her that the infection had spread. He then bashed her on the side of the head with the flat side of an axe. At this point, Gabrielle was so injured and weak and terrified, she fled from the commune and hid in the woods for 2 days, the whole time coming in and out of consciousness. When she finally came to, she touched her head wound and found, to her horror, that there was larvae in it. She headed back to the commune because she really had nowhere else to go. When she arrived, Roch was still drunk. He told Gabrielle that he would heal her, and she agreed. He had Jacques go out and cut the drive shaft off of one of the broken vehicles they had, and Roch heated it in the fire until it was red hot. He told Gabrielle he was going to cauterize her stump. He pressed it to the stump, but he was so drunk that he kept dropping the red hot pipe onto Gabrielle's legs and stomach. When Roch was finally satisfied that Gabrielle was healed, he took a very burned and near-death Gabrielle and placed her in bed to rest from the healing. Gabrielle finally escaped the commune, and on August 16, 1989, she made it to a hospital in a nearby town. She tried to make up a story about her missing arm and the horrific injuries all over her body, but the hospital called the police. The police were not able to secure a warrant for Roch's arrest until the 19th of August, and when they descended on the compound, it was deserted. Roch, Jacques, Chantal, Nicole, and the 2 youngest babies had all fled to Quebec to hide. The rest of the followers had made their way back to their families. After seeing what Roch had done to Gabrielle, they had woken from his spell and wanted nothing to do with him anymore. 6 weeks later, the police finally found Roch and arrested him for aggravated assault for what he did to Gabrielle. Personally, I think they should have charged him with attempted murder, but Jacques, Chantal, and Nicole were also arrested on the same charge for their parts in the attack on Gabrielle. On October 6, 1989, the very same day that Roch and the rest were arrested, Giselle finally came forward and informed the police about Solange's death. Everyone pleaded guilty to the charges. Roch was sentenced to 12 years, which was later reduced to 10 years because he was able to express sincere remorse and concern for the victim. Oh my God, please someone stop this man. Jacques was sentenced to 5 years. Chantal received a sentence of 2 years less a day, and Nicole received 18 months. Charges of first-degree murder were brought against Roch for Solange's murder, but the prosecutors were unable to prove that he had premeditated the act, so the charges were reduced to second degree. I think I could have made a case for premeditation there. Where the hell did this prosecutor get his law degree? The University of Cracker Jacks? My God. Roch's lawyers made a deal with prosecutors that Roch would plead guilty to second-degree murder as long as no other charges were brought against him. Oh my God. See? The Canadian legal system has a history of deals with devils long before Homolka came onto the scene. That is such bullshit. I wouldn't have taken that deal. I would have... Oh... Anyway, on January 18th, 1993, Roch Theriault was sentenced to life in prison. As far as I could tell, the children that were saved from the commune stayed in the foster care system until they aged out or were adopted. Those records in Canada are sealed, as they should be. We can only hope that they had good lives and did good in the world, unlike their father. Roch began serving his time at Dorchester Correctional Facility, which is a medium security facility just outside the town of Dorchester in New Brunswick. Somehow, he was able to father 4 children through conjugal visits with some of his wives who still believed in him while he was in prison, which blows my mind away. He was eligible for parole in 1999 and applied for it, but was denied. He applied again in 2002 for parole, but was again denied. He never applied again for parole. On the morning of February 26, 2011, guards at Dorchester Correctional Facility found Roch dead in his cell, having been stabbed in the neck by a shiv. There was never any doubt as to who had killed Roch. Another inmate, Matthew Gerard MacDonald, had been heard making threats towards Roch, and the two had at one time had a physical fight. When the guards found Roch dead, MacDonald stated immediately to the guards, "That piece of shit is down. Here's the knife. I've sliced him up." Matthew Gerard MacDonald was already serving life in prison, and for the killing of Roch Theriault, an additional 25 years was added to his sentence. Roch Theriault was 63 years old when he was murdered. And that, my friends, is the case of the Anthill Kids cult, led by Roch Theriault. My thoughts. The capacity for human cruelty that this man possessed is staggering. It's difficult to comprehend how a person could descend to such depths of depravity, inflicting such unimaginable pain and suffering on those who trusted and followed him. This was one of the worst cases I've done so far. These horrifying assaults that he carried out on his followers serves as a reminder that blind faith is incredibly dangerous. The need for critical thinking and vigilance when embracing any ideology or leader is imperative as we all try and forge our way through life. We have to cultivate the courage to question and to speak out when something feels amiss. As we saw in this case, by not questioning concerning doctrines and practices, a dangerously deranged egomaniacal killer was allowed to reign free over innocents for years. And with that, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap test done, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.